Okay, hi. So my name is Ed Friedman. For those of you that don't know me, I chair Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. We have a new executive director, Jennifer Brockway. Jennifer, raise your hand. There we go. There she is. Got any questions about what we're doing? Aside from technical questions, you can talk to Jennifer or myself. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, and I'm going to pass around a sign-up sheet. If you would sign that, please, so we know who you are and we get a sense of how many people come to which talk, and helps us better figure out what to offer in the future. Also, we have this basket here, which the series has for many years been sponsored in part by Patagonia down in Freeport. And they usually donate, they always donate, some merchandise that we offer as an incentive for a raffle, little door prize thing. And tonight, I was in such a hurry and had such a big list when I left home that I forgot to bring the door prizes, which are a
Door?
no,
Oh. A cap.
no,
Hat.
yeah, a hat. All right, and a little, oh,
Change.
yeah, close enough, a little bag.
Okay.
So we can have. I was going to say put your name on the thing and put some money in the basket, and we will get your prizes to you. But we have had a sudden donor, which is great, who offered us this wonderful vest as a door prize.
What size?
Look at all those. What size?
Small.
It says extra small, actually.
That's
But
S,
it's
not
got
XL.
an awful lot of pockets for being so extra small.
Right.
And I'm sure those of you that are large, God, it sure looks big, doesn't it?
It does.
All right. It's probably just the thing a sea lamprey biologist ought to be wearing in the field.
Yeah.
So I usually wear a large, and I'd say it fits, well, it's a little snug for that.
You never find them anyhow.
Anyway, so instead of the Patagonia hats tonight, it's a fortuitous donation here, we will offer this vest as a door prize. And what we ask is that this series costs us well over $1,000 a year to put on. And so this is partly why we do this. There's a little thing with scrap paper in it. Write your name on a piece of paper, stick it in the tin, put some money, hopefully like $5, $10, $1 million in the basket, and we'll have a drawing. I'd say the odds are really, really good.
Yeah, it's like a lottery, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, if you look around you here, you see these wonderful tapestries that cover up with some of our literature. But we have some of these trifolds here about what we do here, there, and in the back. Friends of Merrymeeting Bay is a very unique organization in that we are an environmental group, as you know, but we do on research, we do advocacy work, we do land conservation work, and we have a very active education program. Hi, Carol. So we have done a lot of work on not lampreys, but eels. People often think they're the same, but they're not. Litigation with the BEP, the Bureau of Environmental Protection, the DEP. We've been in court over the eels. We work a lot with fish passage, trying to improve fish passage for all of the migratory fish, whether they are anadromous, most of their time in the ocean, come up here to spawn, or catadromous, like the eel, most of their time in freshwater, go out to sea to spawn. So, advocacy work on pollutants, toxics, pesticides in schools. See some literature over there on wireless devices, Wi-Fi, smart meters, cell phones. I've been doing this work for many years, and I consider wireless proliferation to be the most serious toxic threat of our time. It's everywhere. A lot of people getting cancer from it, particularly phones, but people getting a lot of other sicknesses from just being around it. So, and it affects wildlife and plants as well. We've protected well over 1,000 acres, 1,200, 1,500 acres around the bay. Some of it conservation easement, some of it is now owned by the state. We have some picture books over here, ring binders, on each of the different subject areas. So there's some maps in there. We just completed another easement. What month are we in now? Yeah, December, couple months ago. Focus of ours is on the bay and the tributaries, 6 tributaries coming into the bay. So this is a piece, 47 acres, protecting some of the headwaters of the bay. Education, some of you may know, a lot of you don't know. I see a lot of new faces here. Very active education program, both in schools and twice a year outside of schools. We do a Bay Day, fall and spring Bay Day. We have a couple hundred or so kids, generally 4th, 5th graders from around the bay, come out to a site on the bay. We do active hands-on education with them, get them really dirty, have a lot of fun. Fish printing, goiwataku, Japanese way of preserving your catch. Watershed modeling, real archaeology. Beach seining, see who we catch that time of year. Kids love it. We've had kids not want to go home. They say, I want to stay and be an archaeologist. So hopefully we provide a formative experience that maybe comes back to them later on, if not right then.
Is that like the Harry Potter train they get on, they just disappear?
Excuse me?
To the archaeology world, like the Harry Potter train, they get on,
Yeah,
when they say, I want to be an archaeologist, except from them.
they just go, get up and go. So, I mean, we've had kids find musket balls, arrowheads, all sorts of, pottery, glass, you name it, depending on the site that we've been working at. So,
Great.
and it's very, one of our archaeologists at one of the sites we use, it's a state site, you've got to be sort of certified to run the dig there. He was a little jaded years ago, he didn't really want to help us and do it. And he came out there and we saw the enthusiasm that these kids had just in finding bits of glass and brick, and it just lit his fire again. It was really, really nice. So you get that when you're working with the kids. We have a lot of volunteers. We have an extraordinarily high rate of volunteerism in the group, and there's probably, 30% volunteers out of our 450 members. So there's a lot of opportunities for volunteering, and if anyone is interested, on that sign-up sheet, you can check that off. The education is a big place for that. Water quality monitoring, we've been water quality monitoring for a long time all around the bay, up the various tributaries. A concerted effort over the years to upgrade the lower part of the Androscoggin from Brunswick Dam up to the Warumbo Dam. It's a Class C. Now we'd like to get it to Class B. That's what it measures when you go out and measure it. And the reason we try and upgrade is the Clean Water Act and Maine statute have anti-degradation language. It says once you get up, you can't backslide. And we have just filed another proposal to upgrade this section. Every so often the DEP asks for proposals to do that, and we got it together and got it in time to do that. So we'll see what happens. So water quality, education, archaeology digs in the summer we often have. It's a lot of opportunity, and if you're interested in helping with anything or stuffing envelopes, just please check that off, and myself or Jennifer will get back to you. So I think that's most of what I have about us. Again, visit with the information here afterwards. We also have juice and cookies, and I'll hopefully say this again at the end, but our next speaker presentation is in December. They are always the second Wednesday of the month. This one will be a combination of annual meeting, which will just take a few minutes, potluck supper, which is really, really good, and our speaker, Lee Cranmer, former historic archaeologist with the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and his talk is called A Tale of Three Privies. Perfect title for a potluck supper. So that'll be over at the Cram Alumni Building in Bowdoin, which is the second building down on Federal Street from the light on Bath Road, and on the east side of the road. Parking is off of Bath Road in the big parking lot, and you cut up a little path back to the building. So hopefully you can make it there. There's a yellow postcard over there that's got our entire series schedule on it. Our speaker tonight, Steve Coghlan, patiently waiting for our glitches to get fixed, hopefully, and waiting for me. He's come all the way down from Bangor to talk to you tonight.
Farther north than that.
Farther north. The great white
Argyle
north.
Township.
Where?
Argyle Township.
Argyle Township. Where's that?
That's north of Old Town.
Yeah, okay.
It's unorganized.
Unorganized.
Barely on the map.
That's best, right?
120 people?
About 180, yeah.
And you got like 10 feet of snow up there, right?
It melted yesterday, unfortunately, yeah.
So Steve got his bachelor's degree from SUNY, New York, State University of New York, over at Syracuse, College of Environment and Forestry, and he stayed on to do his PhD there. Focuses on, well, his degree in fisheries and wildlife management, but, and your bachelor's was also on fisheries.
Yeah, fisheries and wildlife
as
in
well.
general.
Yeah, so you just keep on playing with fish.
Well, you'll see the stuff I do.
Yeah, so anyway, Steve's been at the at University of Maine for a while, 2012, and he's on their faculty.
2006.
2006.
That's right. I think your information's off.
2000. I thought I saw that on your CV. I thought on the.
Yeah, no.
No.
Boy, time's flown if it's been that quick.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, it's been 12 years now
As a
professor.
the whole time. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. I should let him tell you about himself. So.
Not really exciting,
But,
these are exciting things.
He's done a lot of neat work with community ecology and with a focus on the fish again. And hopefully tonight we'll talk about some of the relationships that the lamprey has with other species as well. Some interesting work, postdoc, right, in Arkansas.
In Arkansas, yep.
Using otoliths, earbone. And I didn't know you could look at chemistry of otoliths.
Yep,
So
you can. You need really expensive equipment.
infer all sorts of things about the organisms and the community from your earbone. And I thought you just could tell age from it, like tree rings. So, yeah, so Steve teaches a number of courses. He's doing active work, community ecology work around Atlantic salmon and other critters. Let me see here. Gotta get the name right. Sejunkadunk, right?
Yeah, when we'll be
Yeah.
referring to it here.
A lot of work on Sejunkadunk stream, lampreys and other critters. So I think without further ado,
All right,
Steve
do I need
Coghlan,
to
and yeah,
hold
so you
this?
can put this on your, slip on your hip somewhere. Not too close to your face.
All right.
Just get your beard up,
Oh, yeah.
You can put it right down your, feel like a fishing rod right there. That probably would work. Yeah.
Right here?
Yeah,
All right.
that's cool.
Okay, let's begin. So I'm sorry, I'm going to be tied over to this console here.
I could sit there and hit the button for you.
It's all right. It's probably easier this way. You can't read my mind. I hope not, unless that's what this thing's for.
Like,
No, it's okay. No, it's fine. It's okay. Actually, if you wouldn't mind dimming the lights just a little bit, this one is sort of right in my face, but I can look here. Anyway, so.
Keep it on the light so it can get you on film.
Oh, okay. Yeah, whatever. All right. So there's going to be a lot of information coming through here. There are three really good texts that really summarize 100 years of literature on lamprey, and that one up there, Life Without Jaws, is really readable for someone who's scientifically literate but not an expert in the field. So a lot of the information that I'm showing you comes from those, sort of a general overview on lamprey, life history. And then I want to give credit to 3 grad students plus a colleague, collaborator of mine, Joe Zedleski. We're going to be talking about some of the work that the grad students mostly do and I get a little bit of credit for about lamprey specifically within Maine watersheds. So if you recall, maybe some of you way back to your introductory biology class, you probably learned about these ancient jawless fish, and the 2 living representatives we have today would be lamprey, the adult and the larvae on the top there, and then the hagfish, the adult and the larvae on the bottom. Maybe seem familiar, maybe you even spent some time dissecting them in your anatomy class. And they're a really good representation of a living fossil. Lampreys really are living fossils. They first appear in the fossil record, about 450 to 470 million years ago, in pretty similar form to they are today, and really compared to how long lampreys have been around. Humans have been here in the blink of an eye, and maybe we'll be gone in the blink of an eye. I don't know. Let's see if we can get lampreys to go extinct before us or after us. We'll see. We're doing a good job. Anyway, so there was a tremendous radiation of these jawless fishes, depending on how you define fish, back 480 to 450 million years ago, and there were a lot of really crazy things that you might remember again from your vertebrate anatomy textbook. But really, there are only two living groups that have survived those mass extinctions: the lamprey and the hagfish. But they've been around for a very, very long time, and this chart just shows you their evolutionary time scale and also the relationships with other animals that we have more familiarity with, the birds, the amphibians, the reptiles, and the mammals. And lampreys are considered true vertebrates, and so lampreys are essentially the sister group with everything else you see up here. So all these groups share a common ancestor going way back almost 500 million years ago. And those hagfishes, there's still argument, are they actually truly a vertebrate? Are they closely related to lampreys? Are they something else entirely? But for our purposes, we can forget that. And looking at lamprey, we see that they retain an awful lot of ancient characteristics. I wouldn't call them primitive. That has a really negative connotation, and lampreys are doing, for the most part, very well, having this very ancient body plan. They don't have a bony skeleton, no true jaws, no paired fins, no gill cover, they have 7 external gill slits, no scales. All of these things really distinguish them from the more modern fishes. They're almost completely cartilaginous on the inside. They're notochord, they're brain case, they have little rudiments of vertebrae, and they have a filter-feeding larvae, so very ancient fish.
Is their vertebrae actually bone, or is it also cartilage?
It's actually cartilage, and they're just little tiny, I couldn't say remnants, they're sort of the precursors of large vertebrate that we see in the other animals. And if we look at the larval stage of the lamprey, also called an ammocoete, very, very similar morphologically and structurally to what we think the ancestral chordate looked like, these little filter-feeding things with a very simple internal skeleton. And if you remember again from your biology classes, the tunicates or sea squirts have this larvae that looks very similar to a lamprey, and that's probably what the earliest vertebrates looked like, those things. So the lamprey, at least the larvae, resembles very superficially some ancient organisms. And then just putting them in context related to the rest of the vertebrates that we know and love, lamprey don't have true jaws, as shown up on the top there. They just have essentially a hole. And the first and second gill arches in these ancient fishes were what evolved into the jaws. The first gill arch is the jaw, the second gill arch is the suspension, and that's an evolutionary novelty, that gave rise, to the success of sharks and all other vertebrates. So lamprey don't have those jaws, but you'll see in just a minute they do have very characteristic mouths. So current diversity, there's about 44 species that are alive today globally. There are both parasitic and non-parasitic forms. And the non-parasitic ones I think are very interesting, but sort of beyond the scope of our talk, because the name of the talk today is sea lamprey. So we do have one species here in Maine, and that is the sea lamprey, Petromyzon marinus. Petro means stone, myzon means to suck, and marinus is of the sea, which is a pretty good name. A lot of the Latin names actually are really relevant to the organism. So that's the one species that we have here in Maine, and maybe my pointer will work. It's not hooked up to anything, so, yes. So here we are looking on the top of the North Pole. There's no ice over Greenland. But anyway, so here's essentially the global distribution of the sea lamprey in red there. So essentially up and down the Atlantic coast, across to Greenland, and over northern Europe into the Mediterranean. And there's a similar species, essentially the same sort of species, closely related over in the west or the eastern part of that range. If we go to the U.S., for a very long time, this is what we thought the distribution of sea lamprey were, native to the Atlantic coast, going up a little bit farther north up into New Brunswick. But then exotic species here in the Great Lakes and also the Finger Lakes and Lake Champlain. And about almost 15 years ago or so, these researchers, John Waldman, his name will come up, they did some DNA analysis of these lamprey, and they hypothesized, or they strongly suggest, that sea lamprey were native to Lake Ontario and Finger Lakes and Lake Champlain. And so then the map was revised to look something like this. So they're probably exotic to the upper Great Lakes above the Welland Canal, Lake Erie and above. And of course, there's always people arguing in the literature. There's this guy, Randy Eschenroder, who says, no, Waldman's full of garbage. And he reconstructed the colonization history. And he argues that the lamprey were actually non-native. And when canals were built, they penetrated from the Susquehanna drainage up into Lake Ontario. So anyway, there's controversy over whether they're native or landlocked, or native or invasive to the Great Lakes. It doesn't really matter, though, because they're treated as if they are an exotic species. So everybody's probably, or maybe you're not familiar, they do get a very bad rap, and probably for good reasons in the Great Lakes. They're considered to be alien invaders. They're parasitic, and we'll get into that in just a second, but you can see the mouth there. They're not warm and fuzzy and cuddly like a lot of our charismatic species. And they do damage to native fish, well, and exotic fish as well. Places like the Great Lakes. This is not so common anymore, but used to be very common, where these large sport fish, in this case it would be exotic Pacific salmon, get attacked by lampreys pretty frequently. A lot of scarring, a lot of wounds on them. And there's been a lamprey control program in place for about 40 years now, where a lot of money is spent, I think a total $20 billion a year. So some of that's spent on poisoning streams. They dump some lampricide in to kill the larvae. And then there's also barriers and traps and pheromones that are used to attract and to capture and kill spawners. But they are managed as an exotic species in the Great Lakes. And there's some pretty good evidence that they did a lot of damage once they colonized Lake Superior here to the lake trout fishery. Seeing wounds like that was very common. Lake trout essentially plummeted about the same time that lamprey were introduced or so. And then the stream treatments, the lampricide, came online in about 1960. Lamprey populations dropped, and then lake trout wounding rates dropped, and their populations went up as well. So it appears that the control of sea lamprey in Lake Ontario and other Great Lakes has been pretty successful. So sea lampreys have a really interesting, complicated life history. So they have this juvenile stage, they're not a sexually mature adult yet, where they're parasitic. They latch onto the outside of fish and other vertebrates if they were in the ocean. They migrate up freshwater streams to spawn. They build these elaborate nests, and you'll see some more videos and details of all these. The eggs hatch out very quickly, and these larvae adopt a filter feeding lifestyle, non-parasitic, and they can live in the streams, burrowed in the mud, essentially just feeding on little particles of detritus for maybe up to 15 years, depending on their growth rate. They undergo a metamorphosis, they transform into a parasitic stage, and go back down to either a large lake or the open ocean. And so we'll just look a little bit more closely at those life history stages. So these larvae, these guys are really cool, but they're very small, and unless you were really looking for these, you'd never see them in the stream. But they dig these little tunnels, and they essentially filter feed like little vacuums. You can see one of them there, where they've all got their mouths open. And they essentially use that oral hood of theirs to vacuum up particles that have settled out on the gravel and the sand. And they'll live anywhere from 3 to 15 to 20 years, depending on their growth rate and the amount of fats they can store in their body. They go through metamorphosis at some point in time. And so you can see the different stages they go through. Looking at them laterally, they develop a really prominent eye. If you look on the right there, you can see how the mouth parts change from a simple filter feeding hood to those keratinized teeth and the rasping tongue. They actually can stick on a fish and rasp that tongue in almost like a little jackhammer and pull out bits of blood and flesh. And here in Maine, there is a little bit of predation or parasitism that goes on in streams. When these transformers are, they've metamorphosed, they can start to tolerate seawater, they start going downstream, they might hitch a ride on a fish, this happens to be a stocked brook trout, and get a quick burst of nutrients and energy, and that sort of sustains them till they get down the open ocean. But for the most part, there's no parasitism on sport fish or any fish here in Maine. All that, except for these limited instances, are out in the open ocean. So sea lampreys don't parasitize fish in Maine streams. And of course, once they do go down to the open ocean or the lake, they lead a parasitic existence for 1 to 2 years, and very, very well adapted for latching onto fish and sucking out bits of flesh and fluid and blood and things like that. And back before lamprey treatment, pictures like that up at the top were not uncommon at all. And you could imagine that a fish can't survive a whole lot of lamprey woundings. All right, so now let's see if this actually works. I have videos here. Okay, yes. So in the spring, I'll talk a little louder over the gurgling. So in the springtime, triggered by photoperiod, temperature, and discharge, lampreys make their way up a stream. They actually follow chemical cues of either larval lamprey, or the females will follow cues of males who are actually following the cues of the larvae. So they don't home to natal streams like salmon or trout do. They simply go wherever the odor is the best that attracts them. Oh, I didn't want to give that part away. So let's see. Will this work? Okay. So once they get up, come on. Maybe this one is not going to work then. Okay. How about... No, I guess we're frozen. All right. Well, that picture doesn't want to, or that video doesn't want to play. Let's try this one. Okay, so they build these elaborate pit and mound structures, nests. They grab, this one doesn't show it quite as well, but they'll grab onto rocks with their sucker disc mouths and pull them down, and they'll pile them up in a mound. They'll undulate their bodies and clear fine sediment. Yeah, you can see one dragging it there. You can see the male, that's the one grabbing the rock right now. He's got that thick, almost rope structure on his back. Underneath is where the testes are, and there's a female there. And that doesn't want to work either. This is the good one too. This is the spawning. No, I guess it is not going to work. Oh, maybe it will. Okay. So anyway, so here's two lamprey. They spent a whole bunch of time building their nests. They do nest communally, but this happens to be just a pair by themselves. And there's a pretty elaborate courtship ritual. They do a lot of stroking and arousing and whatnot. You can see one coming right there. You know, they're obviously enjoying each other here. In just a minute, you'll see the actual spawning process. Also take note, look how fast their gill pouches there are ventilating. Really energetically intensive. They're burning themselves out metabolically. They're not feeding while in their streams. They're up there for one purpose and one purpose only. And it's sort of like a Pacific salmon. They die after spawning, and they just essentially burn themselves out metabolically. And they're going to get to it in just a minute here. I could watch these videos all day long, and sometimes I do. You'll see they're getting ready. And they're going to arch the back in just a minute. And that's essentially spawning right there. There we go. And so you can kind of see those little tiny eggs. They're adhesive, they sink down into the substrate, and they hatch in about 7 to 10 days. Okay? Well, most of those videos worked. We have a few later on. But then ultimately they die. And I had a video of this and couldn't find it, but you can see the snapping turtle is grabbing that lamprey and its pouches are going like crazy. So very much like a Pacific salmon, they're genetically programmed to die after they go up in fresh water. So that's essentially their life history. And so now let's get more into the ecology, the roles that they play, the interactions they have with other fish in Maine. So historically in Maine, we had a lot of species of what we call anadromous or diadromous or sea-run fish. This is a shot from the Milford Fish Ladder, the observation window on the Penobscot River. And we can see 4 of the big players here. We see a sea lamprey up there, an Atlantic salmon right below it. Then there's a big American shad right below that salmon, and then the rest of those fish are river herring, either alewife or blueback herring. So historically, back pre-colonial times, Maine had, and still does to varying degrees, about 12 sea-run species. Most of these are anadromous, and one of them, the American eel, is catadromous, as Ed was saying about before. So the lamprey were one species in this pretty diverse community of sea-run fish. Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, so actually I have this. American eel, American shad, striped bass, short-nosed sturgeon, Atlantic salmon, rainbow smelt, brook trout, which can be sea-run as well. That is a blueback herring, there's an Atlantic sturgeon, there's an alewife, there's a tomcod, also known as a frostfish, and then there's the sea lamprey. So there's the 12 species that historically made up this sea-run fish community. And when these fish were abundant, rivers were essentially full of fish most seasons out of the year. So this is a very complicated diagram here showing seasons going from spring all the way to fall, and then down from the estuary and the ocean up into freshwater streams and up into lakes. And it shows the movements and the different life stages of various species. There's always some sort of sea-run fish in a river. And I guess these red ones here just show when the lamprey larvae are in. They're in tributaries. The adults come up in May or so, and the transformers would leave in November. But they're really only one of many fish that happen to be coexisting in these streams. Well, you all know the story. For a variety of reasons, overfishing, pollution, deforestation, but especially dams, these sea-run fish have declined markedly and in many places have gone extinct with industrialization. And there's John Waldman again, the proponent of the native Lake Ontario lamprey up on the right there with Karin Lindberg, and they wrote this very famous influential paper, it's probably about 10 years ago now, where they documented the declines in these diadromous fish in North America. And they used American shad as an example because they had really good data on it, and they documented what are called shifting baselines. So depending on your window or your frame of reference, how far you go back in time to try to use historical data to piece together what these fisheries look like, you would get very different results. So typically people would refer back to the 1880s and say that was the heyday of shad. We want to restore our rivers to have shad as abundant as they were 150 years ago. But then in some cases they have better data going back and saying, well, even earlier on, shad were even more and more and more abundant. So as time passes, as memories fade, people forget what these streams used to have. We have this phenomenon called shifting baselines where we have different reference points for what restoration or recovery looks like. So, back in the day before European colonization, all these sea-run fish, huge abundance, they were easy to exploit, they were really important for food and for other economic uses. And then people started to dam waterways, deforest, pollute, etc., etc. You know the story. And fisheries have declined, and that now is coupled with loss of memory of what these really large runs used to be. And so when people don't remember what they were like, they're less inclined to invest money to try to bring back these streams to what they formerly were, or even if they could be. And so sea lamprey are probably in that place with a lot of these other fish, is they used to be super abundant, very important, but we just don't know how abundant or how important. Well, everybody's familiar with the story of Atlantic salmon. Atlantic salmon, the declines have been noticed for many years, very popular sport and food and commercial fish. So been a lot of efforts, mostly with stocking, to stem the decline and to help recover Atlantic salmon. And we even had an agency that was devoted entirely to Atlantic salmon. Now it's called the Bureau of Sea Run Fisheries, but it used to be focused mostly on or entirely on Atlantic salmon. So the focus back for a declining fish species was just stock the hell out of it and see what happens. And of course that hasn't worked too well. Maybe for Atlantic salmon it's slowed extinction a little bit, but it hasn't really done anything to recovery. So something like the Atlantic salmon, the Gulf of Maine distinct population segment was listed as endangered in 2000, and it was relisted in 2009 to include a lot of other watersheds, including here the Kennebec and Androscoggin. And of course there were Atlantic salmon all the way down to the Long Island Sound. Those have gone extinct. These guys are endangered. And clearly what we've been doing has not brought them back. So there's been a shift. And don't worry, getting back to sea lamprey here, I know talking a lot about salmon. So there's been a shift really in the mindset, the paradigm of managers. So instead of focusing on just restoring or recovering single species through, say, stocking or habitat protection, now the focus is on communities and entire ecosystems required to support these species of interest. So not only Atlantic salmon, but these other co-evolved species. And just an example of what this paper did was it tried to go back and look at an appropriate baseline. And so all these major rivers in Maine are listed here, showing how many, if there's an estimate for how many Atlantic salmon or shad or herring used to be present. So for example, just here in the Kennebec River, 200,000 Atlantic salmon, 250,000 shad, and probably maybe tens of millions of river herring and alewife. They just have no idea. The point is, an awful lot of fish that are no longer here in anywhere near the numbers they were. So the idea that these Rory Saunders and his co-authors and the new agencies today have adopted is, instead of just looking at Atlantic salmon in isolation, they want to restore entire communities and ecosystems on which these salmon depend. So they argue that these sea-run fish, like alewife, shad, and sea lamprey, are important to Atlantic salmon and nursery streams for essentially four main reasons. So these fish provide food for predators. So Atlantic salmon coming up in the spring to spawn, or overwintering from their spawning the previous fall, they would encounter rainbow smelt coming up the stream. And these salmon are very skinny, they've lost a lot of body weight. Those rainbow smelt come at an opportune time for refueling those salmon. Prey buffering. If you imagine, sorry I didn't have a picture of this, but if you could imagine a little Atlantic salmon smolt, a silvery fish like this, swimming downstream, it's pretty vulnerable to predation unless there are millions of silvery fish about this big, like alewife and river herring, swimming upstream to giving them cover. Fish like sea lamprey especially, but also alewife that come up in huge, massive numbers, deliver a lot of energy and nutrients that they sequestered out in the sea, and they essentially fertilize freshwater streams. And then there's habitat conditioning, where there's some physical disturbance to the substrate, and you'll see, well, you've already seen how lamprey do that. And so fish that do many of these things so significantly that they actually impact the whole structure and function of ecosystems, we would call them ecosystem engineers. And that's where I'm going with the lamprey. We can go out on the West Coast and find examples of Pacific salmon very easily. Pacific salmon are classic ecosystem engineers. They come upstream in huge quantities, they disturb the substrate, they clear out fine sediment, they make these really complex habitats, but they also die and their carcasses rot and they fertilize streams. Those nutrients find their way up into Douglas firs and grizzly bears and eagles and salmon berries and whatnot. And so salmon are the ecosystem engineers of western streams. And the question we had was, well, are sea lamprey the closest thing that we have here to ecosystem engineers in Atlantic coast streams? And if they are, restoring or conserving or strengthening sea lamprey populations would be vital for recovering Atlantic salmon. And so the focus in the past 10 to 15 years or so has been on removing dams to restore these important species. Out in the Pacific Northwest to restore Pacific salmon, but also Pacific lamprey. And out here in the Atlantic coast, a lot of the things that we've done to our fisheries here over the last 200 years are just playing out now in the Pacific coast streams. So people from the West and East Coast are looking at each other's systems as examples for what works and what doesn't. And so the drive today is for dam removal, and people have done a lot of work looking at the responses of salmon on the West Coast and starting to look at responses of other species here on the East Coast. Well, I probably don't have to tell you guys about dam removal. You know, you were the first big dam in Maine, Fort Edwards Dam, to come down. What is that, 20 years ago now? Something like that? 1998. So yeah, almost 20 years ago. And of course, it's been, from what we can tell, a lot of his success story. Millions of alewife have come back, alewife predominantly. There's also some good news for Atlantic salmon in the Kennebec River, especially in the Sandy Creek drainage, or Sandy River drainage. So you guys have lived through this and seen the benefits of dam removal. Well, we're just starting to do this a little bit north of here, and I work mostly in the Penobscot River, so I'll talk about the Penobscot River. And if you're not familiar with it, it was a plan that's pretty close to being completed. 2 large main stem dams were removed down here, the dams right around the head of tide, and then now the lowermost dam is right here in Milford. So now fish have essentially unlimited access to this area here. A couple other dams over on this branch and up here have modified fish and improved fish passage. So the idea is to restore, or at least make it easier for fish to access, they still have to go through some dams and fishways, thousands of miles of original historic spawning habitat. That's the goal of the Penobscot River Restoration Project. And I've been working on that project in the big river, and we see some lamprey in there. But most of the really interesting stuff, at least in my mind, goes on in the small streams, not so much the main river. So I'm going to take you to Sajunkadug Stream that Ed talked about a few minutes ago as sort of one piece of the Penobscot puzzle. So really functionally, the Penobscot River, or any big watershed, is made up of lots of little tributaries and a lot of the really interesting stuff with biogeochemistry and fish spawning and rearing and productivity goes on in these little streams, not so much the main stem river. So Sajunkadug Stream is a small watershed. It flows into the Penobscot right around the city of Bangor and Brewer. And for a very long time, there were at least 2 dams in some form or another. Going back 200-300 years ago, there were many dams on the stream, but there's the Mill Dam, which is just upstream of the confluence with the Penobscot. And then there's the Meadow Dam that essentially fills those wetlands there. Historically, these ponds and wetlands up here provided spawning area for alewife. So this stream was the focus of a very small-scale restoration effort, and this occurred before the Penobscot River watershed, or the Penobscot River Restoration Project. So it was sort of like a precursor, a very small experiment. So that Mill Dam there, the Meadow Dam, that was mostly removed and replaced with an engineered rock ramp fishway. There's a nice pool, riffle sequence designed to get alewife up into the wetlands to spawn. And the way they engineered it, they actually kept the level of the wetlands constant. So they protected the marshy habitat upstream. And the following year, they took the Mill Dam out. And essentially that's what the stream looked like just a few days after removal. And so now, for the first time in 200 or 300 years, sea-run fish had access to that entire, or most of the watershed. And so we looked at that as an opportunity to watch what happens with dam removal and fish recovery in real time. It was essentially a very fortuitous experiment. So among some other things, I'll focus just on the lamprey today. A lot of people did a lot of work in that stream. We got our money's worth out of it. But what we want to do is, first of all, document any sea lamprey recolonization of newly accessible habitat. If we open it up, will the fish migrate up? And then you also use it to better understand the ecological roles of sea lamprey. Are they really ecosystem engineers? Are they necessary or vital for Atlantic salmon restoration? And then it's a good test of whether or not a dam removal had the desired outcomes. So what I'll go through now is just show you some of the results that my grad students and I and collaborators have done over the course of about 10 years on sea lamprey. So this stream is pretty easy to work in. It's small. It's, for the most part, very easily wadeable. You can walk the whole stream in half a day. So we'd set these nets down near the mouth, and we'd capture sea lamprey as they were migrating up in. So we had for a couple years an extensive capturing, tagging, and tracking protocol for them. And then, so we also did nest counts, much like people count reds for salmon as an indicator of abundance. We would do the same thing for sea lamprey. All right, let's see if this works. So just an example, it's actually quite easy to capture these guys. So these fish have already been captured, usually captured once and let go. We would do a survey, and we'd find lampreys on their nests and pick them off very carefully, as you'll see. There's one.
Nice.
Nice. And there is another one. Pretty easy.
Good job.
Yeah. So we pay the undergrads the big bucks to do that. And then this is low tech stuff. I think this is the sort of stuff that we should pay undergraduates to do. Go out and do physical work. It doesn't cost a whole lot. It's low tech. Get good experience. That's my personal opinion. There's a desire to go to very high tech stuff, and I'm not a fan for a variety of reasons. Anyway, so we're giving lamprey here a pit tag. It's essentially almost like a little microchip. When you drive through the turnpike and you go through the Easy Pass, that's essentially what it is. It's an ID. It's got an ID code in it.
I don't remember that being injected in me though.
That was while you were put out. And then there's just a Floyd tag. It's just easier to see that thing on the outside of the lamprey. And so each lamprey is marked individually. So we record that, and we take lengths and weights of them. And we do this for almost every lamprey in the stream. And let's see, there's that. And then later on, you can see this is grad student Rob Hogg there. He's got a pit tag reader, and it's got essentially an antenna that generates an electric field. You wave it over the fish, it's connected to a reader, and it records the ID number of the fish. And there he goes. He's got it. So once you capture a lamprey, mark it, you can recapture it again, and using the captures and recaptures, you can develop a population estimate for those fish for that particular spawning run. So we did that for a couple years. We also did simultaneous nest counts where we'd walk the stream every day. We count nests, we count new nests. We'd have a population estimate of nests. We'd have a population estimate of lampreys. So just some really basic data, ecological data, on this essentially newly colonized area of stream. So just some data pre-removal. You can see these are locations of all the nests, red dots. There was that first dam. So obviously lamprey didn't get above the dam. All the spawning was done below the first dam. And essentially when we took the dam, well, we didn't take the dam out. Trained engineers took the dam out. But when the dams came out, lamprey could then migrate up here. There's a small waterfalls that's probably a natural barrier, but they essentially colonized all the stream that was now accessible to them.
What's the difference in years?
This is 2008 pre-removal. 2009 was a bust because there was a massive flood. And we had similar data in 2010, 2011, they penetrated just a little bit farther upstream. So this is sort of the extent after I think they were fully colonized.
Very quick though.
Oh, very quick, absolutely, very quick. And so just a summary, over the 5 years that we did this, actually there's a 6th year, I just didn't put it in there, going anywhere from 0 fish all the way up to 300 fish or 350 for a population estimate. And we got a pretty good relation between the number of nests that we observed and the number of lamprey that we estimated with our population model. So in the future, one could go out to a stream this size, count the nests, and get a pretty good estimate of the lamprey abundance. And that was the point of that study. And Will that work? No, that's not going to work. There were video of alewife swimming around, but you've probably seen them. But also recolonizing the stream. Atlantic salmon essentially moved up from the lower reaches past that first dam that was removed within 3 days. And then 3 years later, we found 2 age classes of fish throughout the stream. So not high densities, but there was successful spawning. And then alewife came up almost immediately. We found adults coming up. In 2 years after the dam was removed, there were some problems with them getting above that little impassable waterfalls under low flows. But then in August of that year, we found all these juveniles just pouring out of that pond. So these other 2 big sea-run species, the big charismatic ones, they recovered. I want to say they recovered. They were colonized very quickly, within days or within a few years. So, yep, we'll check that off of our list, that these 3 important species did recolonize newly accessible habitat. Then the next question was, what's the effect, the physical and chemical and biological effect of the spawning sea lamprey on stream habitat and the biota? So we had a variety of different techniques. We measured fine sediment accumulation, how embedded the rocks were in the substrate, depth and velocity profiles, interstitial spaces in rocks that invertebrates and fish would use for feeding and hiding, aquatic insects that are drifting and living on the stream bottom, all in the context of what effects would sea lamprey have on all these factors that affect habitat quality for juvenile Atlantic salmon and other stream-dwelling fishes. And just a little bit of data. So here we have, this is actually a diagram of a salmon red, but it's pretty much the same for a lamprey. Water is flowing this way. There's a pit here, and there's a mound, the tail spill. Well, essentially that's what the lamprey nests look like. These are just depths. So we measured them in the summer right after spawning, and in the fall right after 3 months or 4 months after spawning. And essentially they were kind of shallow, they got deep, they got really shallow, and then they tapered off again. So they made these sort of speed bumps in the stream. And then these are just various estimates of water column velocity, the difference in water velocity between the top and the bottom. And we measured it for the mound, that anterior part, or the posterior part, the pit, and then an adjacent reference site. But the point is here is that the presence of these nests made very complex depth and velocity profiles on the stream and increased habitat complexity. And some other measures of embeddedness. After a lamprey got done making a nest, it turns out the rocks were much less embedded than they were beforehand and in adjacent reaches that weren't spawned in. They removed a lot of fine sediment, especially in the mound section. And so both of these things together would probably mean fairly good quality habitat for something like an Atlantic salmon that would spawn. Needing rocks that aren't embedded in the substrate, that don't have a lot of fine sediment around them. And then interstitial spaces, it turns out that, at least in the mound of the nest, there were a lot of little nooks and crannies that could fit juvenile Atlantic salmon.